Alfred and Dereky Hagler, A Love Story, written by Barron, narrated by Jessica Ann Bogart. A word before we begin. This is a love story, but it is not the kind that begins with perfection and ends with a bow. It begins with a December night on a waterfront in Washington, D.C., with a woman who had made herself a promise, and a man who had no idea what kind of life was waiting to find him. It ends, or rather it continues, 34 years later, still together, still building, still choosing each other the way they chose each other in the beginning, when choosing was simpler and harder, all at once. The couple at the center of this book are Alfred and Dereky Hagler. They are not famous in the way our culture usually defines famous. They have not played arenas or sat in the Oval Office, but they have done something rarer than either of those things. They have built a marriage, a real one, with business and debt and loss and grace woven all the way through. And they have kept building, decade after decade, when plenty of people would have stopped. Alfred builds with his hands, Dereky builds with her eye. Between them, they have constructed a life that looks, from where I stand, like exactly the word she has always used for their story, destiny. But here is what she would add, and what this book will show you. Destiny is not passive. Destiny does not fall from the sky. You have to design it. You have to frame it up and measure it twice and do the work, even when, especially when, the ground shifts beneath you. This is how they did it. This is the story of Alfred and Dereky Hagler. Part 1. The Lives They Lived Before. Chapter 1. Alfred, also known as Al, a man takes shape. I did not come into the world knowing how to be the man I eventually became. Nobody does. You start out as yourself, raw material, all potential and rough edges, and then life applies pressure, and then you see what you're made of. I grew up understanding work the way some people understand weather, as a constant, as the thing around which everything else was organized. The men in my life were men who made things, men who showed up, not because they had been asked to explain themselves to the world in some grand philosophical way, but because showing up was what a man did. You did not wait to feel ready. You got up and you went and you put your hands on the problem in front of you. That idea, work as a form of love, is something I have carried my whole life. It took me a long time to understand that I was even carrying it. It took a woman at a waterfront on a cold December night to show me what it meant in practice, what it looked like when two people decided to do that together. But I am getting ahead of myself. Washington, D.C. was where I had landed, and D.C. in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s was a city in motion. If you had a trade, if you had a skill, if you understood how buildings went together and how materials behaved in real weather in real time, there was work to be found. I found it. I was good at what I did, and I was getting better, and I had the particular satisfaction of a person who sees the results of his labor in 3 dimensions. There was a foreman I worked under in those years, a man named Marcus, who had been building in D.C. for 2 decades before I showed up on his job site, who knew the load-bearing quirks of the city's housing stock the way a physician knows anatomy. He did not waste words. His primary form of communication was the quality of his work, and when he told you something, you listened, because he had earned the right to say it. He told me once, when I was maybe 25 and had just made a structural decision on a beam replacement that he had observed from across the site, he said, "You build like somebody is going to live in it." He meant it as the highest possible compliment. I received it that way, but I also received it as a philosophy, and I have carried it since. Everything I put my hands on will be inhabited by a human life. The care I bring to the invisible elements, the ones behind the walls, the ones no one will ever see, the ones that just hold. That care is for the person who will never know it exists, who will simply feel safe without understanding why. I built with that in mind, every day after, and much later, after I met Dereky, after I began to understand what I was actually building toward in my personal life, as well as my professional one. I realized I had been applying the same principle to relationships without knowing it. You build for the person who is going to live in it. You put care into the invisible places. You make it sound. You build like somebody matters, because they do. That is the man I was becoming in those years, in Washington, D.C., before I had anyone to build it for. I just needed to find her. People talk about the satisfaction of building things as if it were a hobby, as if it were some charming secondary feature of a person's personality. For me, it was the primary thing. I liked understanding how structures worked. I liked knowing where the load was, what was bearing weight and what was decorative, what would hold and what would eventually fail if you ignored it long enough. There was an honesty to construction that I had never found anywhere else. A wall that is built right stands. A wall that is built wrong falls. The material does not lie to you. I was, in those years, a man who trusted material more than I trusted much else. I had relationships in the way that a man in his 20s in a city has relationships, with good intentions and limited follow-through, with the sort of half-commitment that comes from not yet knowing what full commitment looks like. I was not a bad man. I was an incomplete one. I was still being assembled. There were things I wanted that I could not have named for you then. I wanted someone who saw what I was building toward. I wanted someone who was building toward something too, something that complemented mine, something that required mine, and mine that required hers. I did not know I wanted that. I would not have been able to say it out loud. But the wanting was there. It was waiting for December 1991 and a waterfront in Georgetown, and a woman in a blue coat who looked at me like she was deciding something. There is a particular quality to the cold in Washington, D.C. in December. It comes off the water differently than it comes off concrete. It has a sound to it, almost, a kind of presence. I remember that cold the night I met Dereky, not because I was thinking about the weather at the time, but because cold like that has a way of making everything feel significant after the fact. The significant things always feel inevitable in retrospect. I was not thinking, this is the night. I was not thinking anything particularly philosophical. I was at the Georgetown Waterfront because I was somewhere in my late 20s, and it was a Friday. And that was where a man in his late 20s in Washington went on a Friday. I did not know I was about to meet the woman I would spend the rest of my life building things with. I did not know she was already there, already watching the water, already carrying the story she would later tell me piece by piece, the story of who she had decided to become. I just knew it was cold, and the harbor was beautiful in that stripped-down December way. And then I looked up, and there she was. Chapter 2, Dereky, the promise she made at 9. You should know something about me before I tell you the rest of this story. You should know what I was carrying before I walked into it. My father had 5 children by 5 different women. 5. I grew up knowing that number, knowing it the way you know a weight you have been carrying for so long you forget it is there, until someone asks you to set it down, and then you realize how heavy it always was. I loved my father. Love is like that sometimes. It is not obedient to logic. You can love someone and still look at the pattern of their life and say, "Not for me." You can love someone and still decide that the cycle ends here, with you, in this generation. I made that decision at 9 years old, not the way children make dramatic statements. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a princess. But the way a child makes a real decision when they have seen enough of the world to understand what is at stake. I made it quietly, inside myself, in the particular way that girls make their most serious promises, without ceremony, without witnesses, just with the absolute knowledge that this is how it has to be. I was not going to be one of 5. I was not going to raise a child wondering where her father was, wondering why she was not enough to keep him, carrying a number the way I carried mine. If I was going to build a family, I was going to build it the right way, all the way in. No exits left open for when things got difficult. I did not know what that would cost me, or what it would require, or who the other person in that story would be. I just knew that when I found him, I was going to choose him completely, and I was going to need him to choose me the same way. I was 9 when I made that promise. I was almost 30 when I found the man who made it possible to keep it. My grandmother used to say, "A woman who builds a home builds a legacy." She said it the way women of her generation said the things that mattered most. Not dramatically, not with emphasis, just as fact, as if it were self-evident, as if she expected you to already know it and was only reminding you. Her home was my first classroom. I did not understand that until much later, until I was studying design formally and began to realize that everything I thought I had learned in school, I had actually learned first in her house. She had a kitchen that smelled like purpose. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Not food, not cleaning products, not candles, but purpose. The smell of a place that is used daily and cared for and taken seriously. The counters were clear, the windows were clean. The light came in at an angle in the late afternoon that she had arranged the furniture around, so that the chair where she sat and read was always in that light. She did not talk about it. She just lived inside the intention. Her bathroom had towels folded a particular way, not for guests. She lived alone for much of my childhood, but for herself, because she believed she deserved that, because she believed that a woman who does not take care of her own space is a woman who has not yet decided she is worth caring for. I absorbed this without words. Children do. And when I sat in my first college design course and the professor talked about the relationship between environment and self-concept, the idea that the spaces we inhabit either affirm or diminish who we are, I did not have to be convinced. I had already lived inside the proof. My grandmother was my first design teacher. She did not know she was teaching anything. She was just living with intention, and I was watching. I thought about that phrase constantly as I began to understand what I wanted to do with my life. I fell in love with design, with the way a room could be transformed, with the way color and light and proportion could change not just how a space looked, but how a person felt inside it. I fell in love with the idea that an environment is not neutral, that the place where a family eats dinner and argues and forgives each other and grows, that place matters, that it deserves attention, that getting it right is a form of love. Interior design was never just a career for me, it was a philosophy, and I had no idea when I was building that philosophy that I was also building the vocabulary for a marriage, that when I eventually found my partner, the work we would do together would be the most literal possible expression of everything I had ever believed about what it means to build a life on purpose. By December of 1991, I was a woman who knew who she was and what she was worth, and what she was not willing to settle for. This is important. I want you to understand that I walked up to the Georgetown Waterfront that December as a complete person. I was not looking for someone to complete me. I was not missing a piece of myself. I had made myself whole through a combination of faith and stubbornness, and the particular discipline that comes from having decided something early and then spending your life making it true. I was at the waterfront because a friend had suggested it, and I had gone because I liked the water in December, the way it held the cold and gave it back to the air. And then I saw him. I did not know his name. I did not know his hands had built things, did not know he understood structure the way I understood design, did not know we were about to become the two halves of something that would take decades to fully build. I just noticed him. He was looking at the water, and then he looked at me, and something in his face, something in the particular way he looked, like a man who was genuinely interested in what he was seeing, made me think, there is a person who pays attention. I have always been drawn to people who pay attention, people who look at what is actually in front of them rather than what they expected to find. He looked. I looked back. The rest of it took a while longer, but that was where it started. Chapter 3. A.L. Washington. I want to tell you who I was in that city, in those years, before Dereky came into the picture and reorganized everything. Washington, D.C. is not an easy city to know. People who are from there, who grew up eating half-smokes and navigating the neighborhoods the way I did, will tell you that the D.C. the world knows and the D.C. they know are two entirely different places. The D.C. the world knows is monuments and marble and the permanent drama of national politics. The D.C. I knew was neighborhood and community, and the particular warmth of a city where Black excellence was not a surprise but an expectation, where you were expected to be something, to do something, to contribute. That expectation shaped me. I am not going to tell you it was always comfortable. Expectations that are real and high never are, but it was formative. It told me, you have something to offer, now go offer it. Get your skills sharp, show up. Do not waste what you have been given. I was building in those years, literally, physically building. The construction work I did was not glamorous, but it was real. I understood the built environment the way someone who actually makes it understands it, from the inside out, from the foundation up. I knew how a house was held together. I knew where the strength lived. That knowledge would become, in time, the most important professional contribution I would make to our marriage. But in 1991, it was just my job. It was just who I was. There were men I came up with in D.C., guys from the neighborhood, guys from the work sites, guys I had known since before I knew what I was going to do with my life. We had a loose tradition of getting together on Friday nights when the week allowed it, somewhere with decent food and no agenda, and just talking. Not about football, though football came up. Not about politics, though D.C. being what it is, politics was unavoidable. We talked about what a life is supposed to look like. That sounds heavier than it was. We were not philosophers. We were tradesmen and mid-level government workers and a few guys who were figuring out their next move. And we talked the way people talk when they're comfortable enough to be honest. One of my friends, Daryl, who was working at the time in city planning, used to say, "Every man I know is building something. The question is whether he's building something that lasts." I thought about that constantly. Because Daryl was right. I was building structures. I was good at it. But what was I building toward? What was the architecture of my actual life? I did not have an answer in those years. but I was asking the question, and I have come to believe that asking is how you prepare yourself for the answer when it arrives, that the question, held long enough and honestly enough, becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls in what it needs. I was also, in that period, a man who had not yet found his anchor. I am going to tell you this plainly because it matters for the story. I had my work, and I had my community, and I had people around me who mattered. But I did not have a center. A person can live a long time without a center, can function, can contribute, can be well regarded, and still know in some private register that something is not yet in place. I did not know the word for what I was missing. I knew it as a feeling, a negative space in the shape of something I could not yet describe. It took meeting Dereky to understand what the shape was. And here is the thing about Dereky. She did not fill a void in me. She did not complete an incomplete person. What she did was something more interesting than that. She arrived as a full person herself, whole, purposeful, carrying her own story and her own design and her own vision for what her life was going to be. And when she stood next to me, something in me understood. This is the partnership you have been building toward. This is what the work was for. You do not find that kind of thing on purpose. You cannot engineer it. You can only, if you are fortunate, recognize it when it arrives. December in Washington is a month of compressed time. The year is ending, and people feel it, and there is a kind of intentionality in the air, a weight of significance that regular months don't carry. I have always loved December in DC for that reason. The city gets quieter in some registers and louder in others. The monuments stand against the gray sky with their particular combination of grandeur and indifference. I was at the Georgetown Waterfront on a Friday night in December of 1991, and I was in no particular hurry, and I was not looking for anything. And then I was looking, specifically, at her. She was standing a little apart from the crowd, the way certain kinds of people stand, not antisocially, but with a self-possession that marks them as someone who does not need the crowd to tell them who they are. She had a blue coat on. The cold was doing what December DC cold does, coming off the Potomac with that particular authority, and she stood in it like she was fine. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I thought, that is a woman who knows something I need to know. I did not know in that moment that she was thinking, that is a man who pays attention. But we were both right. Chapter 4. Dereky, the woman arriving. Let me tell you what I was building toward in the years before that December. I had come to Washington, D.C. as a young woman with something to prove, not to the city, not to anyone watching, but to myself. I had that particular drive that comes from having made yourself a promise early in life. The promise I had made at 9 years old had not dimmed as I got older. It had hardened into something clarifying, a lens. When you know what you are unwilling to accept, it is actually quite clarifying. It removes a great deal of confusion from the landscape. I was unwilling to accept halfway. I was unwilling to accept someone who was not in, all the way in, foundation deep. I was unwilling to accept a love that looked pretty in good weather and dissolved when it rained. I had grown up watching what that kind of love did to a family, and I had decided, not for me. The flip side of that clarity was this: when the real thing arrived, I would know it. I would not need to convince myself. I would not need to rationalize. The real thing would look like the real thing, and I would recognize it, because I had spent my whole conscious life understanding exactly what I was looking for. I want to tell you about my first real solo project. Not the first project where I was the designer in name. There were others before this one. But the first one where I was truly alone with a client and a space and a vision. No one to defer to, no safety net. It was a small apartment in Northeast DC. The client was a woman about 10 years older than me, recently divorced, starting over. She had almost no budget. She had a lot of grief she was trying to transform into something livable. She sat across from me in her half-empty apartment and said, "I need this place to feel like me, not like before, like me now, like who I'm going to be." That sentence went straight into my chest. I asked her questions for 2 hours, not about the apartment, about her, about what she loved, what she had lost, what she was reclaiming, about the places she had felt most like herself in her whole life, and what those places had in common. I took notes. I went home, and I thought about it for 3 days. And then I designed the apartment for the woman she was describing, not the woman she had been. Warm without being fussy, uncluttered, deliberate, light. When she walked through the finished space for the first time, she stood in the living room for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "It feels like me." Exactly what she had asked for. Not more, not less. I cried on the drive home, by myself, in the car, because I understood then that what I was doing was not decorating. It was not retail. It was an act of attention, the act of seeing a person fully, and then building a space that confirmed, "You are worth seeing. You are worth this care." I have never forgotten that apartment. Everything I have done since has been an attempt to do that same thing, at larger scale, with more skill. I was building my design career in those years, and it was going well, and it was mine in the way that things are yours, when you have worked for them, without anyone handing them to you. I have always believed that the physical spaces we inhabit shape the people we become. A room is not neutral. A home is not neutral. The colors and the light and the proportion and the care invested in a space, those things accumulate. They become the environment in which a family either grows or doesn't. They become the background against which love either deepens or fades. This was not an abstract philosophy for me. It came from watching, from paying attention to the relationship between space and feeling, between the built environment and the human beings living inside it, from understanding early that beauty and function are not enemies, that a beautiful home is also, if designed well, a home that works, that breathes, that holds a family the way a good structure holds weight. My grandmother's words were always with me. A woman who builds a home builds a legacy. I was building toward my version of that. I just needed the other half of the partnership. I was 30 years old in December of 1991. I was not desperate. I want to be very clear about that. I had a full life, my work, my faith, my friends, the particular satisfaction of being a woman who knows her own mind and uses it. But I was aware of what I had promised myself. I was aware of what I was holding space for. I was at the Georgetown Waterfront on a Friday night because a friend had dragged me out of my apartment and told me I needed to stop looking at floor plans for one evening and experience the world. She was right, as good friends often are. The waterfront was beautiful in the way winter water is always beautiful, a little dramatic, a little forlorn, the city lights catching in the current. I stood there enjoying the cold, which I have always liked, the way it clears the head and simplifies everything. And then I looked up. There was a man standing across the way, and he was looking at the water, and then he was looking at me, and something in the quality of his attention, the realness of it, the unhurried directness of it, made something in me go still. I looked back, I did not smile yet. I am a designer. I understand the value of negative space. I let the moment breathe. He noticed me noticing him, and he smiled, a little nervous, a little genuine, a little like a man who was trying to figure out whether he was brave enough to do something. He was brave enough. He came over. Part 2, The Harbor. Chapter 5, A.L. Georgetown, December 1991. I have replayed that walk across the waterfront more times than I can count, and I am here to tell you, it was not elegant. I had been watching her for a few minutes, standing a little apart from the group she had arrived with, turned toward the water, perfectly comfortable in her own company, and I had made up my mind that I was going to go over there. I had made up my mind, and then I had second-guessed myself, and then I had made up my mind again, and then I walked. It was about 40 feet. I have built walls longer than 40 feet. I have poured foundations covering more ground than 40 feet. But those 40 feet across the Georgetown Waterfront in December of 1991 were the longest 40 feet I have covered in my life, before or since. I got there. I said something. I am not going to tell you what I said. Dereky will tell you what I said if you ask her, and she will also tell you that she could not believe what I said. And she will be laughing when she tells you, and she will be accurate. And I will be sitting nearby, not laughing, which means I will be telling you something about my character by not being able to laugh about it yet. What I will tell you is this. It was not the opening line of a man who had his act together. It was the opening line of a man who was nervous, genuinely, unusually nervous, in a way I had not been about approaching a woman in recent memory, and who was covering his nervousness imperfectly. She looked at me with an expression that I have since learned to recognize as a very specific Dereky expression. It is the expression that means, I see exactly what is happening here, and I am going to make a decision about how to respond to it. She did not shut me down. She did not walk away. She did not pretend I was invisible, which, given what I had just said, would have been a reasonable response. She smiled, small, contained, but real, and she said, "You can try again if you want." I tried again. This time I said something like, "I'm Alfred, and I notice you're the most interesting person on this waterfront right now, and I was wondering if you'd like to tell me why that is." She looked at me for a long moment. The Potomac was doing its December thing behind us. The lights of Georgetown were doing what Georgetown lights do, a particular elegant warmth against the cold. "I'm Dereky," she said. "That's a beautiful name," I said. "I know," she said. And I thought, there she is. There is the person who is going to change everything. Not because she was arrogant. She wasn't. But because she said, "I know," without apology and without performance. The way a person says something they have simply accepted as true. I had never met someone who accepted beautiful things about themselves so cleanly, without either dismissing them or making a production of them. I wanted to know everything about that quality. We talked for 2 hours. The December cold did what December cold does. It became irrelevant. We talked about DC and what we were building in it, about work and design and construction and what it meant to make things. We talked about family without talking about family, which is the way you talk about family when you are first meeting someone, in the abstract, in the outline, in the things you reveal without meaning to when you say what you care about. Somewhere in that first conversation, I told her something I had not planned to tell anyone. Something about a banister I had rebuilt once in a row house off Georgia Avenue, how the original was solid mahogany from 1928, how I had spent 3 weeks sourcing period-appropriate wood to match it rather than replace it with something new and unrelated, because the house deserved continuity, because somebody had put real material into that house in 1928, and I was not going to be the person who replaced their care with my convenience. She looked at me when I said that, really looked at me, and said, "You understand that a house has a story. Most builders don't." I did not know how to respond to that. It was the first time a woman had understood something about my work in a way that felt accurate. Not impressed, not flattering, just accurate. She saw what I was actually doing. She named it back to me correctly. That was the moment, if I am honest. Not the first look across the water. That moment, her naming back to me what I was actually doing, that was when I understood something had changed. She cared about building homes that held families together. She said it as plainly as that. I built structures. She designed the spaces inside them. I looked at her and thought, "You and I are going to build something together." I did not say that out loud. I had already used up my one awkward opening allowance for the evening. At the end of the night, I asked for her number. She gave it to me. She did not play any games about whether she was going to give it to me. She simply took out a card and handed it to me, in the way that a woman who knows what she's doing handles a transaction she has decided to make. I held that card on the drive home like it was a contract, like it meant something formal had been agreed to, something structural, something load-bearing. It had been. I called her the next day. Chapter 6. Dereky, the man at the waterfront. I'm going to tell you what he said. I've been telling this story for 34 years now, and it never gets old, because it gets better every time. Not because the story changes, but because the context deepens. The more I know Alfred Hagler, the funnier that opening line becomes. He walked across the waterfront toward me with the determined energy of a man who had talked himself into something and was now committed to seeing it through regardless of outcome. I could see, from 30 feet away, that he was nervous. I have an eye for detail. It is literally my profession, and a nervous person carries their nervousness in specific physical ways. He was not carrying his particularly smoothly. He got to me. He looked me in the eye. He took a breath, and he said, "I know this might sound strange, but I think I'm going to know you for a very long time." I blinked. Now, in context, having spent 34 years with this man, I understand that this was actually, in its own peculiar way, the most accurate thing he could possibly have said. He was not wrong. He did not have the tools yet to express what he was picking up on, but he was picking up on something real, and he said it out loud instead of pretending he wasn't. That, I would come to understand, is essentially Alfred Hagler's whole character. He reads the room, or the structure, or the situation correctly, and then he tells you what he sees. But in the moment, on the waterfront, to a woman he had never met, it was objectively one of the strangest opening lines I had ever received. I looked at him. I was deciding something. What I was deciding was, this is either a man who is deeply unusual in a way that I should find alarming, or deeply unusual in a way that is interesting. I was trying to determine which. Something in his face, the way he did not flinch from my looking, the way he held his ground with an expression that was equal parts earnest and appalled at himself, told me, interesting. "You can try again if you want," I said. He tried again. He said his name and told me I was the most interesting person on the waterfront. It was better. It was not poetry, but it was better, and it had the virtue of being genuine, which I have always valued more than Polish. I told him my name. He said my name was beautiful. I said I know. He laughed, genuinely. with surprise. And something happened in that moment that I knew, in my bones, mattered. He was not threatened by my confidence. He was delighted by it. He laughed like a man who had just been shown something that pleased him unexpectedly. And then he leaned in, and we started talking. We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. The particular conversational magic of two people who are good at talking to each other, discovering that fact for the first time. I told him about design, about what I was building in my career, about what I believed spaces could do for people. He talked about construction, about how buildings actually work from the inside, about the relationship between what is visible and what is structural. I was listening on 2 levels at once. I am a designer. I always am. On the surface level, I was listening to what he said. On the deeper level, I was listening to what he was. There is a difference, and it matters enormously in the question of whether a person is worth investing in. What people say about themselves is useful data. What they reveal about themselves without trying is the real information. Alfred was revealing things without trying. He was revealing that he cared about craft, not just skill, but the why behind the skill. He was revealing that he thought about the people at the end of his work, the families who would live in the structures he built. He told me about a banister he had spent 3 weeks restoring, a mahogany original from 1928, because he believed the house deserved continuity, deserved to be met with care equal to what the original builders had invested. I thought, a man who thinks that way about a banister thinks that way about everything. I was cataloging him. This is not romantic sounding, I know, but it is accurate. I was gathering data points, not to construct a case against him. I was not looking for reasons to disqualify him. I was looking for the shape of his character. I was asking, is this a man whose invisible places are sound? Because anyone can perform well on the surface. The question is, what happens when you look behind the wall, at the part nobody else can see? Everything I saw was solid. Everything I found when I looked behind the surface was load-bearing. He was a man who built things, who understood that anything worth having requires work and materials and time and the right foundation, who did not speak in the language of shortcuts. I thought about my grandmother's words. A woman who builds a home builds a legacy. And I thought, what happens when she builds it with a man who actually knows how to build? When he asked for my number at the end of the night, I gave it to him without hesitation. Not because I was certain of where this was going. I am a designer, not a prophet, but because my instincts, which I have spent my whole life sharpening, told me this was worth knowing more about. I did not tell my friend that night, on the walk back to the car, that I had just met someone important. I am not dramatic about these things, but I thought it. He called the next day. I answered. Part 3. Becoming Us. Chapter 7. A.L. The Pursuit. She was not easy to win. I want to be clear that this is a compliment, not a complaint. Dereky Martin, in those early months of 1992, was a woman who was interested in me and was also going to make me prove it. Not in a game-playing way, not in the way that people sometimes treat courtship like a strategic exercise in who can appear least interested. She was not doing that. She was just careful, deliberate. She was a designer, and she approached the question of this relationship the way I imagine she approached every design project. She wanted to understand the structure before she committed to the blueprint. I respected it deeply. I also found it occasionally maddening in the way that you find things maddening when you have decided you want something, and the path to it requires more patience than you currently possess. We went out. We talked more. I learned things about her in pieces. The way you learn the full scope of a building's architecture, not from a single view, but from walking all the way around it, taking in each elevation. I learned about her design philosophy, about her grandmother's words, about the way she thought about space and family and what it meant to build something that would last. And I told her things about myself, about the work, about what I was building toward professionally, what kind of man I was trying to be, what I believed about commitment. I had not been in the habit of telling women those things, not because I was hiding them, but because I had not met anyone who made it feel natural to say them. She made it natural. She listened the way she looked, with full attention, with purpose. When I said something that resonated, she did not perform a reaction. She simply incorporated it, filed it, moved on to the next question. She was doing the structural assessment. I understood that. I let her assess. What I was feeling in those months was something I had not felt before in a relationship, not with the same clarity, not with the same certainty. I was not falling. The word falling implies loss of control, loss of will, a kind of passive descent. This was not that. This was a decision. This was me making up my mind, not impulsively, on the Georgetown Waterfront, though that night had been the beginning of something, but slowly, through a winter and into a spring, through conversation after conversation, through the accumulation of all the things I was learning about who Dereky was, I decided, this is the person I want to build the rest of my life with. I decided it the way I decided structural things, not emotionally, but with full evidence, having looked at the load the relationship was already bearing and concluded, this will hold. Once I decided, I did not waver. That is not bragging. It is just true, and it matters for the story. Dereky needed to know that the person she was considering letting in was not going to be one of the people who left. I could not tell her that. I could only show her. So I showed her, one day at a time, what showing up looked like. We had a particular walk we liked in those months. Along the waterfront, back to where we had started, back to Georgetown, the way you return to a significant place and find it has become even more significant than you realized. We walked that waterfront in every season of 1992. We walked it in the snow and in the cherry blossoms and in the summer heat that makes DC feel like a different city entirely. There was a Saturday in April. The cherry blossoms were out, which in DC is not a small thing, which is the whole city making an argument about beauty and impermanence at the same time, and we were at the waterfront, and she was telling me about a client she was working with, a difficult one, someone who did not know what they wanted but was very certain about what they did not want, and I was listening to her describe the problem and the way she was thinking through it, and I had this moment, quiet, not announced, where I thought, I would like to listen to this woman think for the rest of my life. Not an elaborate thought, not a marriage proposal, just an observation about preference, about what I wanted more of. But when you know what you want more of, and it is in front of you, and you have the chance to pursue it, that is not a small thing to know. That is everything. She started reaching for my hand somewhere in that year. I do not remember the exact moment, only that one day she was not doing it, and then she was, and that it felt like the most significant thing that had ever happened on that waterfront. I held on. There is a conversation I want to tell you about, late in 1992, after we had been seeing each other for almost a year. We were at dinner, somewhere nice, because I was at the age where I understood that Dereky deserved somewhere nice. And she looked at me over the table and she said, without preamble, I need you to know something about me. I put my fork down. She told me about her father, about the 5 children by 5 women, about the promise she had made at 9 years old, about the weight of what she was carrying, and the absolute inflexibility of what she required from any man she was going to let all the way in. She said, "I am telling you this because you need to know what you are signing up for. This is not a casual arrangement for me. It never has been, and it never will be." I looked at her across that table. I said, "I am not a casual man." She looked at me for a long time, the way she had looked at me on the waterfront, assessing, deciding. Then she nodded. One nod, small, but like a seal on something official. That was the moment. That was when she let me in. Chapter 8. Dereky, letting him in. I am going to tell you what it cost me to trust Alfred Hagler. Not because he earned distrust. He never gave me a reason for that. But because trust, for a woman with my history, was not free. Trust had to be constructed the way everything I believed in was constructed. Carefully, with the right materials, on a foundation that had been properly examined. My father's absence had not made me cold. That is a mistake people sometimes make. They assume that a wound of that particular kind makes you closed. For me, it made me precise. I did not close my heart. I put criteria on it. I made requirements. I knew what the structure had to be able to support before I would commit my design to it. Alfred Hagler, through a winter and a spring and a summer, and into a second winter, passed every requirement I had. He was consistent. I cannot tell you how much that word means to a person who grew up around inconsistency. Consistent is not glamorous. Consistent does not get the speeches or the movie scenes, but consistent is the only thing that actually builds anything. A man who is wonderful 80% of the time is, in the end, unreliable. A man who shows up 100% of the time, not perfectly, not without flaws, but present and trying every single time. That man is building something real. Alfred showed up 100% of the time. I told him about my father toward the end of that first year. I'd been deciding whether to tell him for months, not because I was ashamed of my history, but because that conversation was a test, not a trick or a trap. I want to be clear about that. It was a real test, the kind that reveals character. How does a man respond when you tell him the truth about where you come from and what you carry? Does he retreat? Does he minimize? Does he offer sympathy in a way that makes you feel like a problem to be managed? Or does he look at you and say, "I am not that. I am not going anywhere"? Alfred said, "I am not a casual man." He said it simply. He said it the way he said structural things, not with poetry, but with the particular authority of a person who knows what they are made of and is not confused about it. I had been waiting for that sentence my whole adult life. I nodded, and I let him in. Falling in love with Alfred was not what I expected it to feel like. I had always imagined it would be an event, a moment, a revelation, a thing that happened and then was over, and now you were in love. What it actually was a practice, a daily accumulation. It was every morning when he called to say good morning, and every time he remembered something I had said 3 weeks earlier and referenced it as if it mattered. And every time he looked at me with the same quality of attention I had noticed on the waterfront, unhurried, genuine, there. I fell in love with Alfred the way a room becomes beautiful, gradually, through the addition of the right elements, through the slow revelation of a space's potential. And then one morning I woke up and I knew, there it is. There is the love. I also want to tell you about a Tuesday evening in the second winter we were together, before we were engaged, when I was working late on a project and had forgotten to eat, and it was past 9 o'clock, and I was sitting on the floor of my apartment surrounded by fabric samples and color swatches and sketches, and I was, if I am honest, a little overwhelmed. My phone rang. It was Alfred. He said, "Have you eaten?" I had not. He said, "I'm coming over." 25 minutes later, he arrived at my door with a bag of food from a place I had mentioned, weeks earlier, once, in passing, as a restaurant I missed because they made a soup my grandmother used to make. I had mentioned it once, in passing. He had remembered it. I let him in, literally, that time, because he was standing at the door with a bag of food, and we sat on the floor among the fabric samples, and we ate soup, and he asked me about the project, and he listened, and he offered one structural observation that was so obviously correct, and so obviously something I had been avoiding seeing that I laughed for a long time. He did not gloat. He just said, "Sometimes you need someone outside the room to see the room." That is Alfred Hagler. That is who he is. He shows up with soup and he sees the room, and he does not make a production out of either of these things, because for him, they are not exceptional. They are just who he is. I fell in love with that Tuesday. I had been falling for months, but that Tuesday, I knew. I also want to tell you about laughing with him, because laughter, in a marriage, is not decoration. It is structure. It is the thing that releases pressure and maintains air quality and keeps two people able to breathe in the same space for decades. Alfred is funny in a dry, observational way. He notices things and says them plainly, and the plainness is what makes them hilarious. I do not think he always knows when he is being funny. The best humor rarely announces itself, and we discovered early that we could make each other laugh, that there was a frequency we shared, a way of seeing the absurd in the ordinary, that made the ordinary life we were building together feel like something better than ordinary. We danced in his kitchen on a Tuesday night in March of 1993, with no particular occasion and no audience. He put on music, I do not remember what, and he held out his hand and I took it and we danced. Badly, both of us. We were not dancers. We were not performing for each other. We were just two people in a kitchen on a Tuesday, laughing and holding each other and letting the song play. I think that was the night I understood. This is what it is. This ordinary Tuesday. This is what my grandmother meant. A woman who builds a home builds a legacy, and a home begins right here, in a Tuesday kitchen, in the arms of a man who pays attention, dancing badly together like nobody is watching. Because nobody was. And it was perfect. Chapter 9. A.L. We said I do. I proposed to Dereky Martin on the Georgetown Waterfront. I know. I went back to the waterfront. Of course I went back to the waterfront. That waterfront is where our story began, and it would have been wrong to propose anywhere else. I am a builder. I understand the importance of returning to the foundation. I planned it for weeks. I am not a man who does things halfway, and I was not going to propose to Dereky halfway. She deserved a moment that was worthy of what she had agreed to let me be in her life. She deserved December, the same cold, the same river, the same lights, as a kind of closing of the first chapter and opening of the second. Here is something I have never told her, or at least I have never told it this plainly. I had the ring for 3 weeks before I proposed. 3 weeks. I carried that ring in my jacket pocket, in a small box that knocked against my ribs every time I moved, for 21 days while I waited for the exactly right moment. Not because I was uncertain. I had not been uncertain about Dereky for over a year, but because the moment mattered. because I understood from the way she approached everything that she would receive a careless proposal as information about who I was, and I was not willing to give her careless information about who I was. I took her to dinner twice during those 3 weeks. Both times I had the ring in my pocket. Both times something was slightly off. The timing, the energy, the particular quality of the evening. And I did not do it. I went home and put the ring back in the drawer and waited. Daryl, my friend from the city planning office, knew I had the ring. He thought this was extremely funny. He said, "Al, the woman already said she'd marry you in practice. You just have to say the words." He was technically right, but technically right is not the same as right. The third time, I took her back to the waterfront. I was nervous again. The same 40-foot walk, or close to it. This time I was walking toward the woman I had already decided to spend my life with, carrying a ring, rehearsing nothing because I had learned by then that with Dereky the unrehearsed thing was always more true. She saw me coming. She knew something was happening. Dereky reads rooms the way I read structures, and she went quiet and still in the particular way she goes quiet when she is paying full attention. I got to her. I did not say anything strange this time. I said her name. I said, "I love you." I said, "I want to build the rest of my life with you, and I mean that as literally as it is possible to mean anything. I want to build it with you, together." And then I got down on one knee. She said yes before I had fully finished the question. We were married at the end of that December. The ceremony was full of people who loved us, and full of the particular joy that comes from an event everyone in the room can feel is right. Not because weddings are automatically joyful, but because this particular union was one that the people who knew us had been waiting for, had recognized, before we said it out loud. We said vows that meant what vows are supposed to mean, not the comfortable version, not the version you say when you believe love will always feel like a Tuesday kitchen dance and a shared laugh. We said the full version, through hardship, through change, through whatever came, we meant it. I have held on to those vows in the years since, in the way you hold on to good structural choices. Not by thinking about them constantly, but by trusting them. The foundation was right. The foundation holds. I will tell you something about the reception that is true and that Dereky will confirm, because there is a video of it somewhere. We danced at our wedding, not like we danced in the kitchen that Tuesday night. That was private. That was just ours, but publicly, in front of everyone. With all of our full, beautiful inability to dance on proper display. I cannot tell you what song it was because I was too happy to register it. I can tell you that Dereky was laughing, and I was stepping on things I should not have been stepping on, and the people around us were cheering us on with the particular generosity of people who love you and are willing to pretend that what you are doing constitutes dancing. It was the best dancing of my life. It was the beginning of everything. Chapter 10. Dereky. D&A Designs is born. The business did not begin as a business. It began as a conversation. The kind of conversation married people have when they trust each other enough to say the thing that sounds impractical out loud. I'd been doing interior design work. Alfred had been doing construction. We were both good at what we did, and we had been separate. Professionally, I mean, even as everything else was becoming fused. We had built our marriage and our home, and we were building our life. And one evening I said to him, "Alfred, what if we did this together?" He looked at me. "What if D were the design and A were the construction?" I said. "And we built something that required both of us. What if we made it official?" He was quiet for a moment. He thinks before he speaks. which is one of the things I love about him, and one of the things that can occasionally make me want to shake him. And then he said, "Tell me what you're thinking." So I told him. I spread out sketches on the kitchen table. I laid out the concept, an interior design firm with genuine construction capacity, with an eye for beauty and an ability to execute, with a team that understood both the vision and the structure. I said, "It's a simple concept." Alfred looked at the sketches. He picked up one of them. He looked at it for a long time. It was a fairly ambitious renovation concept. Not simple at all, in fact. Not even a little bit simple by any honest structural assessment. He looked at me. "Simple," he repeated. "Simple," I confirmed. He put the sketch back down. He looked out the window. He looked back at me, and something passed across his face that I did not yet have a name for. I would come to know it as the Alfred Hagler expression for, "I see exactly what I am walking into here, and I am walking into it anyway, and you should know that I love you very much." "Okay," he said. DNA Designs was born. We made one rule in the first year of DNA Designs that I believe saved our marriage as much as our business. We called it the 9 o'clock rule, and it was simple. After 9 p.m., we did not talk about work, not the clients, not the projects, not the invoices, not the timelines. After 9, we were a married couple, not business partners. It was Alfred's idea. He said, "I need a version of you that is not the CEO. I married the whole woman. The business only gets part of her." I thought about that for a long time, because he was right, and I had not said it that cleanly to myself, but he had seen it happening, had watched me, in those first months, begin to disappear into the work the way you disappear into a total renovation, where there is no corner of the space that is not being considered and reconsidered and evaluated. He wanted the corner back. He wanted the part of me that was not designing anything. So we made the rule, 9 o'clock. Phone down. The business exists. We exist separately from the business. We still have that rule 30 years later. It is not always easy to keep. There have been nights when a project crisis made a mockery of the 9 p.m. boundary. But it is the intention that matters. The repeated statement of, "We are more than what we have built, and we will not allow the building to consume the builders." I started teaching at General Assembly around this same time, interior design courses for professionals making career transitions. I loved it in a way I had not expected to love it. I loved the act of passing the knowledge forward, of watching someone understand for the first time that design is not decoration, that it is a philosophy. I loved the moment when a student stopped seeing a room as a container and started seeing it as an argument. Teaching reminded me why I did the work. It gave me a language for things I had understood instinctively, but not yet articulated. It made me a better designer, and I think, a better wife. More reflective, more intentional, more practiced at the art of explaining what I believe and why. I want to tell you what building a business together does to a marriage. I want to tell you the truth about it, not the version where entrepreneurship is all freedom and creative joy. It is some of that, but it is other things too. It is arguments about money when money is tight. It is the particular friction of two people who are both good at what they do, trying to figure out where one person's expertise ends and another's begins. It is the negotiation, constant and necessary, between vision and execution, between what a space can be and what the materials and timeline and budget will actually allow. Alfred and I learned, in those early years of DNA Designs, how to fight productively. That is a specific skill, and it is not an easy one. The key is to separate the problem from the person. To be able to say, this design choice is wrong without saying, you are wrong. To be able to hear criticism of your work without hearing criticism of your worth. I was better at this on some days. He was better on others. What we were always better at, together, than either of us was alone. The final product, because my designs came alive when they were built by someone who understood them, who cared about the intention behind every choice, who had listened to what I was trying to do and built it the way I had imagined it, and sometimes better. And Alfred's construction work, already excellent, became something more than excellent when it was guided by a design vision that was coherent, that had been thought through, that made the completed work something you stood in and felt. We were better together, professionally, personally, all the way through. The business grew, not overnight. Nothing real happens overnight, but steadily, the way well-built things grow. D&A Designs became known in the DC and Maryland area for exactly what we had promised, the combination of design intelligence and construction quality. We built homes and transformed spaces, and the people we worked for came back and sent their friends. We were building a reputation, and we were building it on the same foundation as everything else in our marriage: honesty, follow-through, and the refusal to deliver anything less than what we had promised. There is a moment from those early years that I keep in a particular place in my memory. We had just finished a project. I cannot remember which one. There were so many, and the client walked through their renovated space for the first time, and they went quiet. Not a bad quiet. The particular quiet of a person who has just seen something they did not know they needed, and now cannot imagine living without it. The client turned to us, and she looked like she might cry, and she said, "This is my home. This is finally my home." I looked at Alfred. He looked at me. We did not say anything. We did not need to. That was why we were doing this. That was the whole thing, right there. A woman standing in a space we had built together, feeling like she was home. My grandmother's words. Every time. A woman who builds a home builds a legacy. We were building it, together, exactly the way I had promised myself at 9 years old that it would be done. Part 4. When the Ground Moved. Chapter 11. A.L. The Crash. I am going to tell you about the hardest time. I am going to tell it plainly, because it deserves to be told plainly, and because the plain version is already sufficient. There is no need to dramatize what was already, in its honest form, as hard as anything I have lived through. The real estate market collapsed. You know the broad strokes if you lived through that period. The mortgage crisis, the cascading failures, the way an entire sector of the economy revealed its foundations to be not what anyone had believed. For people like us, in the construction and design business, in the residential and commercial real estate space, the impact was not abstract. It was specific. It was our contracts, our projects, our income. We lost most of it. I want to be careful about what I say here. I am not going to give you numbers or specific business details, because those are ours, but I will tell you what it felt like. It felt like watching something you built with your hands begin to fail under loads it was not designed for. It felt like standing in front of a structure you were certain was right, and discovering that the conditions had changed in ways that no planning could have fully anticipated. It felt like failure, even though what had failed was not us. That is a distinction that matters enormously and is very difficult to hold on to when you are inside of it. Dereky and I have talked about what that period did to us, not only to the business, but to us, to the marriage. And I think the most honest thing I can say is this. It took everything we had built together and tested it to failure point. Not past failure point, but to it. There were conversations in that period that I do not want to describe in detail because they belong to us, because they were the most private kind of difficulty two people can have, the kind where you look at each other and the question underneath everything else is, are we going to make it through this? Are we enough? Is what we have built strong enough to bear this weight? I believe there is a specific kind of darkness that comes from financial collapse. It is not just the money, it is the identity. Everything I had built professionally was a part of how I understood myself, how I showed up in the world. I built things. I made things that stood. And now the context in which I had been doing that had been shaken in ways I could not fix or frame or pour a new foundation under. I went quiet during that period. I am telling you this because Dereky will tell you this too, and I want to own it before she does. I went quiet and I went inside, because that is what I do when I am trying to work something out. I go to the place where the thinking is, and I work it out in private. And the person I love most is sometimes the last person I talk to. The texture of that period is what I want to describe, because people talk about hard times in the aggregate and miss what they actually feel like in the specific. What it felt like in that period was this: the silence on job sites where phones used to ring, the particular quality of the hours between 9 and noon when new contracts used to come in, and now they didn't. The calls to creditors that I made standing in a corner of the house where Dereky couldn't hear me, not to spare her, she knew everything, but because I did not want her to hear the sound of my voice making those calls, because the voice I used to make those calls was not the voice I wanted to give her. I still showed up every morning, that much I can tell you. I still put my feet on the floor and got dressed and made coffee and showed up to whatever work there was, not because I felt heroic about it, but because the alternative, lying down, giving up, letting the business failure become a personal failure, become a marriage failure, was simply not something I was willing to do. I had told her, I am not a casual man. I was not going to be casual about this. That is a flaw. I am aware of it. The almost. I am going to tell you about the almost. We had one conversation, one long, hard, honest conversation, the kind that married couples are supposed to have, but that feels like open surgery when you are actually having it, in which we said everything, the fear, the grief, the anger that had nowhere to go, the question of whether we were going to come out of this together, or whether the combination of the financial stress and the silence and the distance that stress had built between us was going to become permanent. It was not a gentle conversation. It was the conversation that a marriage needs to have when it is under that kind of pressure. And it was painful in the specific way that honest things are painful when you have been honest with yourself about things you didn't want to be honest about. We did not break. I am here to tell you that we did not break, and I want you to understand that not breaking was not passive. It was a choice. It was two people looking at each other in the worst circumstances they had yet faced together and deciding, we are not done. This is not how the story ends. Dereky said something that night that I have held on to ever since. She said, we have built things that lasted because we built them right. We are built right. We are going to last. I believe her. She was right. Chapter 12. Dereky. We don't quit. The crash was the test I had not known I was preparing for. I had spent my entire adult life building things, my career, my marriage, my business, my faith, with the understanding that foundation is everything, that the work you do before the difficulty arrives is what determines whether you survive the difficulty. And then the difficulty arrived, and it was bigger than I had anticipated, and everything I believed about foundation was either going to be true or it wasn't. It was true, but let me tell you what true looked like in practice. It did not look like serenity. It did not look like two people smiling bravely through hardship with inspirational music playing in the background. It looked like two people who were scared and exhausted and sometimes short with each other in ways they were not proud of, but who kept showing up to the same table, in the same house, for the same conversation, until they found their way through. It looked like Alfred going quiet when I needed him loud, and me having to decide whether to be angry about that or to understand it and find another way. It looked like me, in the middle of the night sometimes, sitting with my faith and my grandmother's words and asking, is this what building looks like in the down times? Does building still mean building when the project is falling apart? And the answer that came back every time was, yes, especially then, especially in the down times. The down times are when the foundation is tested, and the foundation holds or it doesn't. Ours held. I want to tell you about the day I decided we were going to rebuild. Not the day we said it to each other. That came later. But the day I decided it in myself, in the private place where a person's real decisions are made. There was a morning, early, before he knew I was awake, when I came downstairs and found Alfred standing at the kitchen window with his coffee. He was just standing there, looking at the backyard, or not quite looking at anything, looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they are not seeing what is in front of them, but working through something behind their eyes. He had been quieter in that period than I had ever known him. The quietness was not withdrawal. I want to be clear about that. He was still there. He still made coffee and showed up to work and sat with me at dinner. But the volume had been turned down, the way it goes down in a person who is carrying something they haven't yet found the words for. I stood in the doorway and I watched him for a moment, and something in my chest did a particular thing. Not hurt, exactly, and not fear, exactly. Something more like recognition. This is the man I married. This is what carrying looks like for him. He is not leaving. He is thinking. He is not giving up. He is working out how to continue. He is a builder, and he is standing at this window trying to figure out how you build when the ground has moved. I went and stood next to him. I did not say anything. He did not say anything. He put his arm around me. We stood there for a long time. The coffee got cold. That was the morning I knew we were going to be fine. I was sitting in our living room, the living room I had designed with the particular care I brought to every space we inhabited, the room with the light I had planned for, and the proportion that I believed made the people in it feel held rather than confined, and I was looking at what we had built. Not the business, the home, the actual home, the walls that Alfred had worked on, the choices I had made, the objects we had accumulated over years of being together. And I thought, look at this. Look at what we made. Look at what it still is. The crash had not taken the house. It had not taken the marriage. It had not taken 30+ years of waking up next to the same man and choosing him every morning. It had not taken the memory of the kitchen dance or the Georgetown Waterfront, or the promise I made at 9 years old that I had kept every single day since I let Alfred Hagler in. We had lost money. We had lost business. Those things were real, and their loss was real. But we had not lost us. We rebuilt. That is the summary. I could tell you the steps, the decisions, the pivots, the hard work of rebuilding a professional reputation when the market that had supported you has fundamentally changed, but the steps are secondary to the fact. The fact is, we rebuilt together. The way we built everything, with her eye and his hands and the shared stubbornness of two people who do not believe in quitting. It took time. Real rebuilding always does. By the time we came out the other side, DNA Designs was different than it had been before. Smaller in some ways, stronger in others. Rebuilt on a foundation we had examined and found solid from the inside. I told Alfred in those rebuilding years, I have a new project idea. It's a simple one. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he said, "Tell me." And I told him about what I wanted to do with Mrs. Maryland, about the idea that had been forming in me about how to use the platform, not just as a title, not just as a ribbon and a crown, but as an actual instrument for the kind of change I had always believed design could make. He listened the whole time. When I finished, he said, "Let's do it." Part 5. The Mission. Chapter 13. A.L. Mrs. Maryland. I want to say something about pageants before I tell you this part of the story. I want to say it because I am an honest man, and honesty requires acknowledgement of one's full range of initial responses. My initial response when Dereky first began talking about pageantry as part of her professional and community work was, I will not elaborate on what was inside the It was the response of a man whose experience of pageants was limited and whose instinct was that this was not the arena in which Dereky's particular kind of talent was going to be most fully expressed. I was incorrect. I want to lead with that. I was wrong in the most instructive possible way, the kind of wrong that teaches you something about your own assumptions and the people you think you know. The Mrs. Maryland title was not, for Dereky, a crown. I understood this eventually, and then I understood it more deeply, and then I understood it in the full way that you understand something when you watch the person you love use it. Let me tell you what changed my mind. Not one thing. It was not one thing. It was a sequence. The first thing was watching how other people responded to her when she walked into a room. I have been married to Dereky for decades, and I have watched people respond to her for all of that time, and I know what it looks like when someone commands a room. But the title gave the commanding a container. It gave people a framework for receiving her, and I watched that happen. And I watched what she did with the attention once she had it. She pointed it, every time. Not at herself, not at the platform, not at the crown, at the thing she wanted people to see. A veterans family, a community that needed design support, a young woman who needed to understand that her home could be something other than what she had been given. Dereky used attention the way a good builder uses a tool, with precision, toward a specific end, without waste. The second thing was a moment I did not expect. Someone came up to her at an event, a woman I did not recognize, older, a grandmother type, and said, "I saw what you did for that family. My son served. It meant something to me to see that." She walked away. Dereky turned to me. Her face was not triumphant, moved. The way you look when something you believed was right turns out to actually be right, which is not the same feeling as pride, but is more durable. I thought, there is the woman I married. That is what she is made of. It was a platform. It was a framework. It was a way of bringing together everything she had spent her professional life building. The design expertise, the community commitment, the belief that a home is not neutral, that the spaces where families live shape the families themselves, and aiming it at something that needed it. She aimed it at veterans. The Veteran Home Restoration Project was Dereky's idea in the specific way that all of Dereky's ideas are her ideas, fully formed, practically considered, and presented to me with a certainty that made the word simple feel almost plausible. She said, "I want to use the platform to restore a veteran's home, the design work, the real work, donated. I want a family that has served this country to come home to a space that tells them, you are valued. Your home should say what the country sometimes forgets to." I looked at her. She looked at me. I thought about all of it, the logistics, the time, the coordination, the particular complexity of a restoration project done right, done in a way that was worthy of the people it was for. I thought about who this woman was, who she had always been, the 9-year-old who made a promise, the woman on the waterfront who looked at me and decided to let me try again, the designer who stood in finished rooms and watched clients discover they were finally home. I said, "Tell me what you need me to build." We worked on that project together. I'm going to be honest. Some of it was hard in the logistical sense, coordinating materials and time and the specific requirements of that particular family's needs, the way any real construction project has a dozen problems between the concept and the completion. But here is what I remember most about that project. I remember the day we finished. I remember walking through that home after the work was done, going from room to room with Dereky, and feeling the thing I always feel when a project has been done right, the particular satisfaction of a structure that is sound, a space that has been attended to with care and skill and intention. And then I thought about who was going to live in it, what they had done, what they had given. I am not an emotional man in the demonstrative sense. I have my internal register, and it runs deep, and it is mostly private. But standing in that finished veteran's home next to my wife, I felt something that expanded past my usual containment. I looked at Dereky. She was looking at the living room, the light we had planned for, the proportions that made the space feel generous, the details that said, "Someone thought about you when they made this." She turned to me. Her eyes were bright. She said, "This is why we do it." Yes, yes it was. Chapter 14, Dereky. The Veteran's Home. Design, I have always believed, is an act of love. I know that sounds like something you would put on a motivational poster, and I am aware of that, and I am saying it anyway, because it is true, and because truth does not become less true when it is also aesthetically portable. Design is an act of love. When I stand in a space before I have touched it, and I begin to see what it could become, when I begin to understand how to shift the light and reorganize the proportion and introduce materials that serve both the eye and the life lived inside the space, I am practicing a form of care. I am saying to the people who will live there, you deserve beauty. You deserve to be held well. Your home should do for you what a good home does. It should make you feel that you belong to something, that you are not in the world alone, that there is a place that was made specifically for you. Every project is a form of this. The Veterans Home was this, amplified. When Mrs. Maryland gave me a platform, I understood immediately what I wanted to do with it. I did not need to deliberate. I had spent my entire career believing that design could change how a person felt in a fundamental way, could change how they felt about themselves, about their family, about their right to take up space in the world with dignity. Veterans in this country are sometimes not held well by the world that benefited from what they gave. This is not a political statement. It is an observation. The men and women who serve come home to a country that is often too busy or too indifferent to attend to them the way they attended to us. And they live in the same spaces as before, sometimes deteriorating, sometimes under-supported, as if the service they rendered was complete and the world has moved on, and they should move on too. I wanted to say something different with my hands. The family we worked with, I will not give you their names because that privacy is theirs, had a home that needed restoration, not in a dramatic, catastrophic way, in the accumulated incremental way that homes fall into disrepair when the people living in them have been focused on other things, when time and resources have been stretched in other directions. We came in, Alfred and I, D and A designs. I designed, he built, the way we have always worked. But it felt different this time, in a way that I am still finding the words for. It felt like everything we had learned to do together, every argument about a design choice, every problem solved between my vision and his execution, every client who had stood in a finished room and felt the space shift around them. It felt like all of it had been preparation for this family, this home, this particular act of saying, your service mattered, your comfort matters. The place where you rest your head and eat your meals and raise your children deserves to say something to you every day. And what it should say is, welcome home. Welcome home, and thank you. And you are not forgotten. I want to tell you about the bedroom specifically, because the bedroom is where I spent the most time, and it is the room that meant the most to me. And I think it is the room that will tell you the most about what I believe design is for. A bedroom is the most private room in a home. It is where a person begins and ends each day. It is where they are most vulnerable, most themselves, most in need of a space that says, you are safe here. You are held here. The outside world cannot reach you here. For a veteran, for a person whose work required them to be always ready, always alert, always prepared for what might come, a bedroom that says you are safe has a specific and particular meaning. It is not a luxury. It is a restoration. It is the built equivalent of, you have done enough. You can rest now. I spent 3 weeks on that bedroom. I got it right on the 3rd revision, which is my usual ratio. The light was directional, warm in the morning, dimmer in the evening, the kind of light that is calibrated to the body's needs rather than the eye's preferences. The proportion was generous, without being cavernous. I wanted the room to hold rather than overwhelm. The materials were durable and dignified. Nothing cheap, nothing precious, nothing that would require constant maintenance or careful handling. Everything in that room was chosen to communicate, you do not have to manage this. It will take care of itself. You only have to rest. Alfred installed the window treatments by hand. He spent a full day on them. He did not tell me until later that he had redone them twice because the alignment was not exactly right. He said, the light has to come in exactly how you planned it. That is Alfred Hagler. That is my husband. That is why we have been doing this for 30+ years. The day we finished, I walked through every room. I do this with every project. I do a final walk, alone, before the client sees it. I walk through the finished space and I look at it and I ask, did we get it right? Is there anything the space is not saying that it should be saying? Is there anything that has been overlooked? Any detail that has been given less than its full due? I walked through that veteran's home and I asked those questions, room by room. Every room answered yes. We got it right. I stood in the living room, the one where the light came through the windows exactly as I had planned, the one where the proportion gave the room a generosity that made you feel welcome the moment you crossed the threshold, and I let myself feel it. All of it. The 9-year-old who made a promise, the woman at the waterfront, the Tuesday kitchen dance, the crash and the rebuild and the years of getting up and going back to work. Alfred saying, "Tell me what you need me to build." All of it. This was what I had been building toward, not just the room, the capacity to stand in it, the life that had made it possible. My grandmother's words, finally, fully understood. A woman who builds a home builds a legacy. Yes. Grandmother. Yes. Alfred came in behind me. He stood next to me. He looked at the room. He did not say anything for a while. Then he turned to me, and his face had the quality it gets sometimes. Not quite emotional, in the way that people perform emotion, but moved in the deep, private way that is actually more significant, the way a structure responds to a load it was built to bear. He said, "This is why we do it." I took his hand. I thought, yes, and also, this is why we do everything, all of it. The marriage, the business, the rebuilding, the mission. All of it comes down to this, a room that says "Welcome home," and a man next to me who helped build it. Destiny, I thought, but not the passive kind, never the passive kind. Design. Chapter 15. A.L. What 34 years looks like. People ask me sometimes, what does it look like? What does 34 years with the same person look like from the inside? I think they expect me to give them something either romantic or cautionary. Either, "It's the best thing I ever did, it only gets better," true, but incomplete. Or, "It's work, it's harder than anyone tells you," also true, also incomplete. The honest answer is more interesting than either of those. 34 years looks like fluency. It looks like two people who speak a language together that is entirely their own, who have spent so long translating each other's preferences and silences and expressions that the translation has become instantaneous, has become the way you think. I know when Dereky is excited about a design idea before she says it, because there is a specific quality of attention she brings into the room with her when she is turning something over in her mind. I know when she is frustrated because the frustration sits in her posture before it reaches her face. I know when she needs me to be present and engaged, and when she needs me to get out of the way and let her work. And she knows me, which is both the great gift and the occasionally uncomfortable fact of a long marriage. She knows when I have gone quiet because I am working something out, and when I have gone quiet because something has hurt me and I will not say it. She knows the difference between my "okay," that means okay, and my "okay," that means I will need to revisit this tomorrow. She knows, without my telling her, when I am proud of something she has done. She says she can see it in how I stand, which I do not think is true, but which I have given up arguing about. What I want to tell you about 34 years is this: it does not diminish. That is the thing nobody told me when I was young, that if you build it right, it does not diminish. It deepens. The woman I met on the Georgetown Waterfront in December of 1991 was remarkable. I knew it then. What I did not know was that every year would add another layer of remarkable that I would discover, repeatedly and without anticipation, new things to be astonished by in the person I had chosen. Her intelligence, her stubbornness, which is the same quality as her strength, experienced from a slightly different angle. Her faith, which is the architecture of her interior life in the same way that good bones are the architecture of a building. Her humor, quiet, dry, timed perfectly, operating on a frequency that I am sometimes the only person in the room receiving. Her capacity for generosity, the way she works, the way she has never, in 34 years, given anyone less than her full attention when they needed it. The way she still reaches for my hand, I want to tell you about an anniversary, not the big round number 1, the specific kind that tells you more about a marriage than the ceremonial occasions. We had planned, 1 year, to go somewhere nice for our anniversary. A restaurant, reservations, the whole production. The kind of evening where you dress up and go out and let the occasion feel like an occasion. We were both looking forward to it. Dereky had been working long hours on a project, and I had been doing the same, and we were both ready for an evening that was just ours. The day before our anniversary, the project she was working on hit a crisis, a contractor issue, a timeline collapse, the kind of thing that cannot be deferred and cannot be delegated and requires her specific attention for as long as it takes. She called me at about 4 in the afternoon and said, "I don't think the reservation is going to work. I'm sorry. I know what we had planned." I told her not to worry about it. That evening at 7:30, when she finally got home, I had driven to a diner about 15 minutes from our house, a very ordinary place, Formica counters, the kind of pie that is not pretentious, but is genuinely good. And I had gotten takeout, soup, a couple of sandwiches, a slice of that pie. I had set the kitchen table with the good dishes, because the occasion deserved the good dishes even if the food came in a bag. I had found somewhere to get a small bunch of flowers, nothing elaborate. She walked in and saw the table. She sat down. After a moment she said, "This is actually better." I said, "I know." We ate soup at the kitchen table on our anniversary in the good dishes, and it was completely unheroic and completely right, and I would not trade it for the restaurant. That is 34 years. It is the diner, in the good dishes, because the occasion deserves honor even when the plan has changed. It is the person across the table who knows what the good dishes mean and receives them correctly. I am not going to pretend that 34 years has been without friction. The friction is part of the picture, and I would not want a portrait that left it out. We have had our seasons. We have had the years that were easier and the years that were not. We have had the particular friction of two strong-willed people who are both sure they are right about something, and who have had to learn, again and again, that being right is less important than being in the relationship. I have had to learn that silence is not always the right response. Dereky has had to learn that sometimes what looks like stubbornness in me is actually fear, and that fear responds better to approach than to confrontation. We have both learned these things, more than once, because that is how it works. You learn something, and then you forget it, and then you learn it again from a slightly different angle, and the second time, it goes in deeper. D is what I call her. I have called her D since somewhere in those early years. I do not remember exactly when I started, only that it became the natural shorthand, the word that meant all of her without having to say all of her. It stands for different things depending on the day. Dereky, always. Design, because she is always designing something. The room, the project, the plan for what comes next. Determined, because she is the most determined person I have ever been in a room with. Delight, because that is what she has been, consistently, since the first night. And destiny. I go back to that, because I do not know another word for the specific feeling of looking at your life, the whole of it, the choices made and the hardships weathered and the things built and the things lost and the things rebuilt, and understanding that this is exactly where you were supposed to be. Destiny, because I knew that night at the waterfront, before I knew how to say it, I am going to know this person for a very long time. I was right. I am still right. Chapter 16. Dereky. Destiny by Design. Here is what I know after 34 years. Love is not a feeling. I mean, it is a feeling sometimes. It has that quality, particularly in the early days, the particular brightness of new love, the way it makes ordinary things seem lit from within. But if it is only a feeling, it does not last. Feelings are not structural. Feelings cannot bear the weight that a life together requires you to bear. Love is a decision. It is a daily, renewable decision. It is the choice to stay and to try and to be honest and to return to the table after you have walked away from it in frustration, to come back to the same person with all your full, imperfect humanness intact and say, I am still here. I still choose this. I have made that decision every day for 34 years. Some days it was easy. Some days it was the hardest thing I did. The hardness was not a sign that something was wrong. The hardness was a sign that something mattered, that this was real, that we were building something real, and real things require real effort. I want to tell you about something that still makes Alfred laugh, or rather makes me laugh, while he tries to maintain the expression of a man who is not laughing. We were talking recently about this story, about the book that would tell it, about the way our life would look from the outside looking in. And I said to him, it's a simple love story when you get down to it. We met, we chose each other, we built things together. He looked at me. He looked at me the way he has been looking at me for 34 years when I used the word simple. He said, I am not falling for that again. And I laughed, and he laughed, and it was a Tuesday afternoon, no occasion, no audience, no reason, and we were sitting in our kitchen and laughing together the way we have laughed in every kitchen we have ever had, going all the way back to the night we danced badly on a Tuesday in 1993. That is still happening. That is still us. I said at the beginning of all of this that my father had 5 children by 5 different women, and that I made a promise at 9 years old that the cycle would end with me. It ended with me. I want to say that plainly, without ceremony, but with full weight. I broke that cycle. I built the family I promised myself I would build. I chose one man, completely and without exit. And I have been choosing him every morning for 34 years, and he has been choosing me. It was not easy. I want you to know that, because the version of this story that is easy is not the one that helps you. The version that helps you is the true one. It was hard. It was beautiful and hard. It was everything a real thing is. But I built it. We built it. With my eye and his hands and the particular faith of 2 people who both believed, down to their bones, that the right foundation holds. I think about what I want the people watching this marriage to understand, not the people who know us well. They already know. I mean the people on the periphery, the clients who come to us year after year and notice something in the way we work together. The students in my General Assembly classes who see a photograph of the business we built and ask how long we have been doing this. The young couples at the events who look at Alfred and me across a room and are watching, I think, for something. Some evidence of what long love actually looks like up close. I want them to understand that breaking a cycle is not a dramatic act. It is not a single moment of decision that changes everything. It is a daily practice. It is the Tuesday morning when you choose to say the kind thing instead of the efficient thing. It is the way you set the table even when no one is watching, because the person coming home deserves the table set. It is Alfred's 9 p.m. rule, held for decades not as a restriction, but as a declaration. I want the whole woman, not just the one who runs the business. The children who grow up around a marriage like this, and I have thought about this since we were young enough that children were still in front of us. They absorb what they witness, the way I absorbed my grandmother's house, without instruction, without explanation. They see how two people look at each other across a kitchen. They hear the particular quality of laughter that belongs to two people who have been through something together. They take in through the walls and the dinner table and the Tuesday mornings the lesson that is the most important lesson there is. Love is a choice, made every day, and the person you make it with is the most important structure you will ever build inside. That is what I wanted to teach, not with words. With the 34 years, I think about destiny differently now than I did as a young woman. When I was young, I thought destiny was a track, a predetermined path that existed out there, and your job was to find it. Now I believe something more interesting. I believe destiny is a material. It is what you are given, your history, your gifts, your wounds, your vision, and what you do with that material is design. My father's choices were the material I was given. My grandmother's words were material. The 9-year-old who made a promise was material. The woman who walked up to the Georgetown Waterfront in December of 1991, carrying everything she had decided to be, that was the design. And Alfred was not a coincidence. Alfred was the answer to a question I had been asking for years. Who builds the things I can see? Who is the other half of this project? Who is going to be all the way in, no exits, for the whole thing? The answer came to me on a cold December waterfront, in the form of a man who said, nervously and accurately, "I know this might sound strange, but I think I'm going to know you for a very long time." He was right. He has been right every day since. That is not luck. That is not accident. That is a life that two people built together, on purpose, with intention, with faith, through everything the world had the audacity to put in front of them. That is the design. That is the destiny. That is the love. Epilogue. There is a waterfront in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., where in December it gets cold the way December cold knows how to be, coming off the water, carrying a little bit of everything. If you go there on the right night, you can stand where they stood in 1991 and look at the river and understand something about what is possible when two people both know what they are building toward and find each other in the middle of it. Alfred still calls her Dee. She still tells him her design concepts are simple. He still makes the face. They still laugh. They built a business from nothing and watched it collapse and rebuilt it from the bottom up. They stood in rooms they made together and watched people discover that they were home. They gave their work, their actual professional work, their life's work, to a veteran family who deserved to feel that this country remembered them. They are still building. D&A Designs is still open. Alfred builds. Dereky designs. The business they raised from nothing, the one that went underwater in 2008 and came back because they decided together in a kitchen in Bowie, Maryland, that it was going to come back, is still there, still creating spaces, still saying to the people who walk through its doors and its projects, "You deserve to be held well." They went back to the waterfront in Georgetown last December. They go every year, or near enough. They do not make a ceremony of it. It is not a tradition with a name or a rehearsed ritual. It is only that December comes, and the cold comes off the water the way it always has, and one of them suggests it, and the other one says yes. Alfred reached for her hand at the waterfront. She took it. They stood where they had stood in 1991, not the same people, and completely the same people, because that is what 34 years of choosing someone every day actually does. It does not diminish you. It makes you more fully yourself. The foundation goes deeper. The structure grows more sound. That is the proof. That is what love, kept over a long time, looks like from the inside. A hand reaching, and another one already there. That is what 34 years looks like from the outside. On the inside, Alfred Hagler will tell you, it looks like the woman he met on a waterfront, in a blue coat, in the December cold, who looked at him when he said something strange, and smiled, and said, "You can try again if you want." He tried again. He has not stopped. Love is hard. Love is worth it. Love stays. A final word from Barron. This book is inspired by publicly available material about real people. Interior emotional content has been dramatized. No scandal, infidelity, abuse, or private family detail has been invented. Where the public record was silent, the narrative has been softened, omitted, or generalized. Alfred and Dereky Hagler are real. Their 34-year marriage is real. D&A Designs, their work with veterans, Dereky's Mrs. Maryland platform, and the Georgetown Waterfront origin of their story are all part of the public record. Everything else in this book is faithful to the spirit of what that record reveals about who they are and what they have built together. This is the story of Alfred and Dereky Hagler, two people who understood, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that the things worth having are the things worth building. They have built a marriage and a business and a mission, and they have done all of it with the same principle at the center. The right foundation holds. If their story has moved you, if it has reminded you of what is possible when two people choose each other with full intention and stay chosen through the full range of what a life delivers, then it has done what it was meant to do. Every great love story is also an instruction. The instruction in Alfred and Dereky's story is this: design your life on purpose. Do not wait for destiny to arrive. Go find it, choose it, build it with someone who knows how to build. You can find more love stories like this one at Books by Barron, where every book is a testament to the one thing that has always been worth telling about: love that endures. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a review. Tell a friend. Pass it on the way all good things get passed, one person at a time, because one person at a time is how love spreads. Thank you for listening. It has been a privilege to tell their story. Thank you for believing. Love is hard. Love is worth it. Love stays.